Welcome to Dreamcatchers Episode 7. I'm Lex Napa here with Sammy, creator of the oral history project Gathering Voices, which shares the stories of people raised by gay, lesbian, and bisexual parents. So thanks so much for being here. I'm so excited about your project, and if you're ready, I just want to jump right in. So tell me what Gathering Voices is all about.
Great. Thanks, Lex. It's really nice to be here. Gathering Voices is an oral history project of young adults raised by gay and lesbian parents in the 80s and 90s. And so I've been talking to people who are now in their mid to late 20s and through their 30s, talking about their experiences of being raised in gay families.
So what has your experience been so far in gathering all of these voices? I gotta imagine growing up in the 80s and 90s, it's a completely different, experience than what it might be today. So what are you finding? What are you learning?
Wow. I don't know. Do we have many hours to talk? I guess the easiest way to start explaining that is I'm hearing what matters to people.
Yeah.
I feel like the beauty of an oral history and getting to do work where I'm sitting down with people, much like this, with a recorder and asking people questions about their lives, is that I ask a question and it's like the door that we walk through together and then get to the other side. And what's on the other side of their histories and the things that have mattered to them and how being raised by gay parents has shaped the people that they've become. And for each and every person, that's a really different story.
Right. So what inspired you to this idea?
Well, I was raised by lesbian moms in Cambridge, and so in some ways, sometimes people ask me, how long have you been working on Gathering Voices? And the technical answer to that question is about 1.5 years. That's when I sat down for my first interview. But I think in a lot of ways, I've been working on Gathering Voices since I was born. This is so deeply my story and the story of what I consider my community, other young adults raised by gay parents. And so I have kind of always been working on this and always ready to have these conversations. But I would say that about 3 years ago, probably, it was a mixture of different things. One is that I was working at a 9-to-5 and it was good. It was social justice focused work. It was social service work. I liked what I was doing in a lot of ways, but I also just really wanted to be creative and I wanted to make art and I wanted to own my own time and set my own direction for a creative project. And I love talking to people and I love hearing their stories. And so I decided I wanted to do this. And it was kind of an idea that I had a very murky idea of oh, wouldn't that be cool? And I'd really like to travel and hear people talk. And then I was having lunch one day with my friend Ryan, who worked at the same job with me. And we were sitting outside. It was the very beginning of spring. It was one of the first days that we could be outside. And he said to me, he was like, you should travel around and talk to people with gay parents and interview them. Get a van and just drive around and talk to people. And I guess I think of that as one of the genesis points for Gathering Voices.
Yeah.
And then from there, it took me about 2.5 years to actually sit down to my first interview and start the project.
Yeah. So what was that time like between having, the spark of the idea and then figuring out 2 years later how to carry it through?
That's a great question. There's an essay that I'm trying to work on that's right now completely inside of my brain about how Gathering Voices has been a total parallel process for me in terms of where I've been at in my life and where Gathering Voices has been at. It's been the same. I remember, so I had this idea, right, that I wanted to do this project. And then and I was talking about it, and at first I started saying things I have this idea. I think I might want to do this one day. And then people would say, yeah, that sounds cool. And then, maybe 6 or 7 months later, it shifted to, I think I'm really going to do this thing.
Yeah.
And then people would be supportive of it. And then slowly it shifted to, I'm going to start writing some questions for this. And I'm going to sit down to do these interviews. And now finally, I feel like I'm in the midst of this big project. Let me tell you about it. But it was very bumpy, slow, but also I don't mean to say that as if it should have gone faster. I think it has progressed at exactly the speed that it's needed to progress. And Like, I think about the 6 months before I actually started sitting down to interviews. And this was the 6 months when I was really taking the project seriously, but I wasn't buying the recorder and starting talking to people yet.
Right.
And that was a time in my life when I had recently left that job and I was kind of going off into the world to start this creative whatever would come next. But I was really in flux, and I think I really was in a moment in my life where I was struggling to find my own voice, and in a really holistic sense in my life. Like, who were my people? Who did I want to be? Where did I want to live?
Right.
What were my values? And it was hard for me to find my feet on the floor. And same with Gathering Voices. I had this idea, right? I had these amorphous ideas of what I wanted to do, but I couldn't find my voice to actually start speaking with other people.
Right.
And then it's just kind of progressed from there. Like, I found my voice and some more of my footing. I started the interviews. I feel like this past year, in the last 6 months, I have, even the last like 4 or 5 months, really settled into, okay, this is what I'm doing now. I moved into a new apartment, and I just kind of started on a few paths. And so it makes sense to me that now is the time too that I'm taking Gathering Voices to the next level and making it really public for the first time. Even though I've been working on it for a year and a half and had done 25 interviews, it wasn't super public.
Right.
And then just in the last month and a half, I've been like, yeah, it's time.
Yeah. So finding new footing, kind of coming out of a stage of being in real flux in your life has kind of helped you kind of find your footing in your project at the same time.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So what has it been like just going into people's houses or having people come to you and just, sitting down and having like these frank conversations? What has it been for you to hear these stories?
Well, that makes me think of two things. One is like the actual practical aspect of meeting a stranger for the first time and sitting down with them in like places that I've met. People have been like, oh, can you come over to my sister's apartment? She's not here this afternoon, so we can hang out there. Or like, I'm home visiting my mom. Can you come over to my mom's apartment? Or like the janitorial closet at the high school in Provincetown. And so there's always that moment of like, meeting this new person who I share some experience with because we're both from gay families, but other than that, we don't really know each other. And I feel like the experience of the interview is the experience of shared sameness is what gets us into the room. But what makes the room come alive and what makes the project actually have depth and meaning is that through the process of talking to each other, it goes from shared experience to some sort of feeling of connection.
Right.
Something with more depth.
Yeah. And I feel like that's what sharing stories is all about, is finding that connection and that community beyond just, having the similar traits, but really having a solidarity through story and expression. And it just kind of like, it syncs you up with another person. And that's a really cool experience to have.
Yeah. I also, when I was thinking about, you asked before about what has been my process getting to this project. And some of it is that if someone were to ask me, Sammy, what has it meant to you to have gay parents? How has that shaped the person that you've become? I honestly don't really know how I would answer that question. And so I ask that question every time I do an interview with people. And people really struggle to answer it because there's not a 1 or 2 sentence answer.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, my moms were lesbians and so I became this type of person as a result. I think of it more like this metaphor. So if at the beginning of the interview, I'm sitting with someone as if there's like a sheet over their head, right? And they're underneath it. And then I ask them these questions, and in the process of answering it, it's through their story. They're like punching shapes out of the sheet and like putting their hands out or putting their legs out or moving their head around. And so the sheet like moves around in a shape around them. And that shape is what it means to have gay parents. But it's not a 1 or 2 sentence answer. Right.
Yeah, and it must be really hard to feel put on the spot to come up with some, pithy, concise way of encapsulating that life experience. Because, through the stories that you're hearing, there's probably a story in you that you want to be able to, come through your interviews, something that you want to evoke, something that's aligned with your passion, something that makes a statement. But it's hard because having a statement like that, it doesn't seem possible.
your question of, is there something that I'm trying to bring through in these other interviews?
Yeah.
I think is actually a really nuanced and complicated one.
Right.
I think as I've continued to do this project, it's become less and less about me and more about other people. But I listened to some of my early interviews, and honestly, I think, oh my God, I can't believe I asked that follow-up question. Or I can't believe I missed that opportunity to ask this question. Or I can't believe I'm still talking. Like, why am I still talking?
Yeah.
And I really hear myself as an interview having grown a lot during this process. And I also think about, so I guess that is to say that at the beginning, there might have been more subconsciously in me trying to find myself reflected in other people's stories. And I think now that I've talked to about 30, 35 people, it's less about trying to find myself reflected in them and more a real appreciation for whatever story they're bringing to our conversation. But I think about artistically, ultimately I want to shape these into a book. And everybody is going to get their story told through their own words. So I'm transcribing all of the interviews and then shaping the transcript from a 20-page raw document into like a 5 or 6 page narrative, but using only people's words that they've spoken themselves.
Yeah.
So I think about, as an artist and as the shaper of this project, what of me am I going to share in this book?
Right, because that's really inevitable. Like when you're taking something raw and kind of turning it into something more finished, there's an artist's eye, there's a subjective eye that's looking at all of that. So yeah, it's an interesting question to think about, is what do you think that you're imbuing into your work, whether conscious or not? Yeah,
that's a really good question. Do you want me to try and answer it?
I mean, you could try, yeah.
I think I'm imbuing, at my best, I hope I'm imbuing a real reverence for the spoken word and the messy, complicated nuance of life. I am not looking for an easy answer. I'm not looking for an easy response even. Like even that question that I just gave as an example before of how is having gay parents shaped who you've become? I'm not looking for an easy response for that. I ask that question, I think in part, because part of gathering voices is to say there is no easy response to that question. And so I ask it to elicit the complication that arises from that question. I also want, we as kids of gay parents raised in the 80s and 90s, grew up in a really pivotal time for gay people in this country. And I have a real curiosity for that, of like, what did that mean for us as the first generation to have parents who were really out and making families outside of heterosexual relationships. Of course, there have been gay parents as long as there have been parents.
Right.
But we are a generation that was very visible for the first time. And we came of age during gay marriage. Like that was so far off anybody's radar when we were born. And now some of us have parents who are married, if that's important to them and that's what they've chosen to do. So how do we make sense of that as a generation? And how did we grow up in our families, which were almost universally loving and supportive and joyous, and I don't even want to say proud because it feels so trite, but proud, and live in a world that was still violent towards gay people and gay families in particular. And yet we didn't internalize that homophobia. Or if we did, we still managed to survive it. And I think in a lot of ways transcend that homophobia. And so I'm very interested in the power of that story. I also think geographical differences make a really significant.
How so?
There are some people who I was raised in Cambridge by lesbian moms in a multiracial family, and I didn't know a lot of other kids with gay parents, but I never felt isolated. I didn't feel picked on. Certainly there was homophobia. Certainly people were saying gay, fag, dyke all the time in my high school. You know, homophobia was in the water.
Yeah.
But I didn't feel isolated. And my mom had tons of lesbian friends. I was deep in gay community. I've talked to other people who during the course of our interview, I've asked them, so what was it like when you first met somebody else with gay parents? And they've pointed to me and said, you're the first person I've ever met with gay parents.
Wow.
And so I guess actually now that I'm thinking about it, that's both geographical and cultural, is how much exposure people had to queer community and to people who shared experience of being raised by gay parents.
Right. So where does the geographical span of your interview take you? Do you go beyond Cambridge?
I do. So I've done, I think, over half of my interviews at this point over Skype.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, which is really wild. Like, I cannot tell you how much I am going back to the parallel process thing. Like, I'm learning how to Skype. I'm learning how to use microphones. I'm learning how to do all of this stuff that I didn't know how to do before. And not that I'm like a total dinosaur. I am a millennial. Like, I do know how to use this stuff, but I've talked to people who were raised in the Midwest, upstate New York, definitely the Boston area, because that's where I'm based, Canada, California, Seattle, DC, Texas, Alabama, North Carolina, kind of all over the place.
Yeah, so you're kind of getting experiences from not just this area of the country, which is, you know, probably more accepting than many other places. I'd even venture to say in the world.
Yes.
So you really do get to hear this really wide, broad symphony of voices coming together, all having different experiences growing up.
Yes, I would say that that's true.
Is there one story that particularly stands out or something that you carry with you?
Yes and no. I think there are maybe two genres of stories that really stay with me. One are the ones that really resonate with me and feel so familiar and to my own experience. And the other are stories that are really, really different, like that really teach me things. I would say that every interview that I do, I feel honestly like it is a gift. I am being given the gift of this person's story, but also I'm being taught a lot, not just about their individual life, but about all sorts of things. I'm thinking right now about my friend who I interviewed, who's become my friend through this process. And she grew up in the Midwest, and she talked about being involved with the cases in Wisconsin, bringing gay marriage up to the Supreme Court of the state, and then also in the DOMA case of the Supreme Court of the United States court cases, and writing briefs and being one of the kids who was part of the movement. And she talks about this experience that she had not that many years ago. I think right when Wisconsin was deciding their case and looking at briefs. And she wrote this addendum to the organization that was putting this all together. She had already written her thing about like, love makes a family. My moms are wonderful people. They deserve the right to marry.
Yeah.
And then she went home just so frustrated one day and wrote this other piece. And she said, you know what? You can use this or not. I don't even care. But my moms don't deserve to get married because I'm like our ideal conception of what a young person should look like. That I'm in graduate school and I'm successful and I've never gotten in trouble and I'm white and my moms have been together and monogamous for 30 years. They deserve this because they're people. And fundamentally, me proving my legitimacy to you is never what this should have been about.
Yeah, I gotta imagine proving legitimacy is a huge part of the work that you're doing and something that you probably actively have to try to avoid in a lot of ways to keep it from looking like, you know, that you're trying to prove something. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
It's such a big idea.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So the first one is my own personal story, and the other one is the purpose of this method of telling stories. So I guess I'll start with that second one, is that there are a few things out there in the world, both online and then one printed book that I can think of right now that tell the story of young adults with gay parents. But none of them are long form narrative. All of them are broken up into different categories or different quotes, and they're written more sociologically or journalistically as more qualitative interview research. And that's great. Like, I am so glad that those things are out there. I want everyone to go and read them, honestly. And it doesn't get at what I hope Gathering Voices gets at, which is long form narrative where you get to dive into one person's story uninterrupted for several pages or several minutes if you're listening to the audio. And you get a sense of the nuance and the contradiction and the complexity of that person. Because in that complexity is the nuance and the depth to counter what I call the two-dimensional broad brushstrokes that have been used to paint the lives and the stories of kids raised by gay parents. Because we did grow up in a movement that we had to stick to the narrative of healthy, happy, well-adjusted families.
Yeah.
And I don't think that serves us.
Right.
And I think that we're ready to move past it. I'll also say that living in the age of Trump and the potential demise of our democracy, it's a different time to think about putting a project like this out into the world.
That was going to be my next question, is how the political climate's shaping your work.
It's a really good question. I think it's not shaping the actual interviews and the conversations and what I hope that this project can be. It is adding to some of my fear that I've had since the very beginning of this project, that putting out anything other than happy, well-adjusted children is dangerous to our families, because we still live in a world that's dangerous for queer people. Like, physically, actively, actually dangerous, and emotionally, spiritually, psychically dangerous. Mm-hmm. Deeply. All of us have wounds about growing up in gay families for that reason, because of the homophobia of other people. And so I do worry about that. I worry about putting that out in a world that's still hostile and increasingly hostile to gay people because of the current administration. And I still know that this work is important, and I still know that this work is part of justice work.
It takes a lot of vulnerability to say, you know, this is the truth. This is what it really looks like to be from a marginalized community.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And the part about telling my own story is that when I was about like 11, 12, 13, I started seeing different patterns in my family that I didn't like. I started seeing like addiction and racism and in the groundwater homophobia, not in my immediate nuclear family, but in my larger family, certainly with my grandparents. And I just knew, nobody had to tell me, but I just knew that I wasn't allowed to talk about that. Because I had always been the first kid I've ever met with gay parents. And so if I were to then say to that person, or in a way that that person would then hear, oh yeah, and there are also really hard things about my family, I just felt like I couldn't do that.
Yeah.
That wasn't allowed. Exactly, it was off limits.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I have tremendous respect for your story, and I'm so glad that you've been here to share what really sounds like something so nuanced, and I'm really excited to hear more about what Gathering Voices is about, and I'm just all about this project. So thanks so much. And I just have a couple more questions for you.
Great.
So I'm wondering if you have any advice for, you know, the young person listening to this today who's really invested in an idea or has yet to come up with a passion. Any advice for them to really follow their dreams?
Yes, do it. Do it, and find your people who are going to support you. That's a really big one. Wow, I just got chills. It's really a big one. Yeah, like find your Ryan who's going to talk to you on your lunch break and come up with ideas with you, and find the people who are going to say like, yeah, that paragraph that you just wrote about that project makes sense. You should post that on Facebook, or you should share that with this group of people. And I got some advice from a friend of mine, again, in that amorphous period before I had actually sat down to an interview. And I said, you know, I'm just so nervous. What if it's bad? What if it's stupid? What if they think my questions are really bad? What if it's boring? You know, whatever my concerns were at the time. And she said, Sammy, probably the first 3 times you do it, it is going to be kind of bad. And she said, if you weren't worried about that, I would be concerned that you didn't care enough about your project.
That's a good point.
Right? And it's been so impactful for me, because I'm like, all right, you just kind of have to do it. For myself, I get really stuck in perfection.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, this matters so much to me. I have to do it perfectly, and people have to get it, or else I'm not doing it, and then I can't put it out in the world. And that's just a recipe for disaster. That's a recipe for self-doubt. That's a recipe for never getting your project done.
Right. Yeah, so finding people who can inspire you, who can elevate you, who can figure out how to help you share your voice, and also kind of overcoming that inner critic, which can be so tough and so loud when you care about something so much, and when it's deeply personal too. Thinking about that parallel process of, you know, the perfectionism in your work and the perfectionism that you were expected to hold.
Yes.
You know, growing up, there's a lot there, and I thank you so much for sharing these stories, and I can't wait to hear what's in store.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I say one more thing about some advice that I have for the creative process? People can feel it when it's real. If the art that speaks to me is raw in a certain way, it's vulnerable, and things that are too packaged or too perfect or too neat, they're not as meaningful. And I think for artists and for people trying to get their work out into the world, show up as you are. Show up as you are. I read something by Ernest Hemingway, and he talked about when he wrote, he tried to leave out all the interstitial tissue, and he would just put out what needed to be said. And he said, trust the reader, because the reader will understand what you're trying to put on the page. You don't need to explain every single little step to them. And I have that written up next to my desk because I just find that so helpful.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. It was lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Lex. This was great.
This has been an episode of Dreamcatchers. Thanks for listening, and remember to always keep dreaming.